Heather created the Strategic Alliance to Fight Exploration model, which is also known as SAFE, and has employed it to great success in Washington the last 4 to 5 years, bringing multidisciplinary leaders together to fight human trafficking strategically, holistically, and collaboratively. Her work sparked a fire, and now there are safes popping up in other cities to include Orlando, Tampa, Denver, and the Twin Cities. Kari is the executive director of NCF Twin Cities Justice Funds. NCF leads locally focused community giving models to bring donors and multidisciplinary leaders together, like law enforcement, legislators, and nonprofit EDs, to fund projects addressing critical gaps and needs strategically and holistically across the spectrum, from prevention to intervention to restoration. Welcome, ladies. You have the floor.
Thanks for having Kari and I with you today. It's so good to be with people who understand this issue already, so we don't have to talk about explain what trafficking is and all of that. So it's just good to be amongst our friends and family on the issue. So because of that, I'll jump right into the SAFE model, why we started it, how it works, why it's effective. This is different than what you've heard about before. This isn't an anti-trafficking nonprofit that's fighting a part of the thing. This is a model to get after an entire movement. So I think it will dovetail with your strategic plan a little bit. I'm going to talk about SAFE in Washington State. I saw Virginia on the call. Hey, fellow friend, see, you can see it's dark outside my window. Yeah, because it was 4 something in Seattle when I got out this morning to be with you. So I'm out in Washington State in the US. That's where this whole effort got started. But as you'll learn from Kari in a bit, there's SAFEs in other regions as well. And they're also moving the needle in the anti-trafficking movement. So why did SAFE get started? The first reason there is that this is about a decade ago, anti-trafficking nonprofits out here were competing for resources with one another and for board members. It was kind of tough a decade ago. Almost every organization was new and they were trying to carve out their niche all the time, which means they didn't really want to collaborate with each other. Excuse me. Because they were all new and trying to make their way. But that led to victims falling through the cracks. And no one really focused on the whole movement. In fact, there wasn't even really a movement at all. And in addition, that middle part, donors wanted to help, but they didn't know where to start or who was doing the best work. I got a call one day in 2012 from a prominent local business guy out here, and he said, "Heather, it's Barry." He was all breathless because he just learned about this. "I just learned that there's girls in the hotel down the street from my office and they're being exploited. What do I do? I'm sick about it. What do I do?" And he said, "You're working on this issue. Like, what should I do?" And so I gave Barry this long answer, like, "Well, Barry, if you care about prevention, like you guys at Rotary are focusing on, you could look into this organization that's doing curriculums in schools. Or if you care about long-term restoration for survivors, you could look into this organization that has safe houses and programs and la-di-la." And I'm sure if Barry and I had been in person, his eyes would have just glazed over. Because he doesn't know what he cares about. He doesn't know even what prevention, intervention, he doesn't know what those words even mean in this space. And that conversation with Barry and with others like him usually led to no action by donors. He doesn't know what he cares about in those things. He doesn't have time to research all the local organizations, figure out who is doing good work. He just wanted to help. And we didn't have any easy answers to help donors engage who just wanted to help. And that led to a lack of funding for the movement. And then the last part of that slide is that all sectors were working in silos and there was really no strategy to move the needle. The prevention people were working over here, the restoration people were working over here. No one was creating a strategy, right? Thinking about it like you all as business people often think about things. We wanted to move the needle, but no one was thinking about the thing as a whole, which meant that the things that were getting funded were just getting funded because that organization happened to be able to raise some money. But it wasn't necessarily the most critical need in the movement. And that led to little noticeable change in the movement. And as it said, just in your strategic plan slide deck, I love seeing this. You guys know the reason that it's so important to be coordinated and movement minded. your strategic plan said having a well-organized approach is because there's a well-organized infrastructure of traffickers, right? The people on the dark side of this issue are very well coordinated. The pimps, the traffickers, the bartenders, the madams, the brothel keepers, they know each other, and the criminal network's pretty vast. And so we knew we needed to be well coordinated and organized as well, and strategic, just like is in your plan, and movement minded. We couldn't be focused on one thing or another thing. We needed to look at the whole movement if we're going to have any chance to win this fight. So this is our landscape in Washington State until about 2014. When Barry, the guy who called me that day, and another businessman named Steve, they came to me with heavy hearts for those who were being trafficked. And by then, both of them had been supporting an organization here, an organization there, and going to a fundraiser. And those organizations were addressing parts of the problem, but they continued to be dismayed at how the anti-trafficking organizations weren't working together. And no one seemed to be thinking about the movement as a whole. And they wanted to do something about that. So Barry and Steve and two experts in the anti-trafficking field and me met for a year to try and discern what we should do. And we wrestled and we prayed and we did a landscape analysis of all the orgs doing the work and tried to figure out, are we supposed to fill in gaps or all that stuff? And at the end of that year, SAFE was born. So what is SAFE? Strategic Alliance to Fight Exploitation. SAFE is an alliance of businesses, philanthropists, law enforcement, justice system, nonprofits, all these folks who have united as a movement. We talk about like linking arms, you can see my arms, linking arms with each other as a movement to combat commercial sexual exploitation. And I'll say we chose specifically to fight sexual exploitation, not human trafficking as a whole at that time, because not because labor trafficking isn't bad, because it's terrible, but because we really, sex trafficking what was heavy on our hearts. And so that's what we pursued. SAFE is also a strategy. That's the strategic S part that gets after the most critical needs in the fight against sexual exploitation in the areas of prevention, intervention, and restoration. That's the movement part, is to focus on all those pieces. And then we create these phase strategies to get after them one at a time. We create them with experts in the anti-trafficking field, including survivors with lived experience all the time, because we want to make sure we don't do anything stupid. So we incorporate their wisdom, their leadership, and their experience. Before I talk about the fund, one of the things that we decided when we started SAFE is that we didn't need another nonprofit in this space that would compete with the current ones. You all know there's a zillion nonprofits out there working on their slice of this, and they were doing good work. And we didn't need to come in and compete, be another player in the field to compete. But it seemed that what our movement really needed out here was a funding mechanism for the most critical work happening. So we started a fund. It's a donor advised fund, happens to be at National Christian Foundation. It's a fund that receives, so tax deductible donations can come into that fund from community members, SAFE partners, all kinds of folks, businesses. They invest those funds, and then we take the funds that are in our fund and invest those in qualified, vetted nonprofits who are moving the needle to fight exploitation. Kari's going to tell you a bit in a second about how that works. But I'll just tell you that we chose National Christian Foundation as our nonprofit, where our donor advice fund is underneath, not because SAFE is a Christian organization, because we are faith neutral in that way. And we want everyone to come to the table, faith or not. But because NCF is one of the only donor advice funds that can receive donations from multiple sources. So lots of people can give to it. And we needed that functionality to make this work. And NCF's been a great partner. The last thing I'll say about that before I kick it off to Kari is one of the blessings of having a fund underneath someone else's nonprofit umbrella or starting a full-fledged nonprofit is that we have super low administrative costs because it all happens through there. They do all our accounting, they do all this stuff. And so it's a super lean model, the SAFE model. We bring money in and we send it out, which allows us to get almost all the funds that come in straight out to the movement to meet the most critical needs. All right, Kari, off to you.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Yes, my name is Kari Norman, and Heather was the architect of this whole model, as she explained. And I'm leading the effort to replicate her strategy that she came up with here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. So we'll talk a little bit about how the model works. You can think of it like an hourglass. You have people who want to stop sexual exploitation and trafficking in their state so they can make a contribution to their SAFE. They get their tax deduction. And then the SAFE Advisory Board follows an expert-informed strategy to disperse funds to the organizations doing the best work across the categories of prevention, intervention, and restoration. So it's an interesting hybrid between a nonprofit that raises funds, except for a cause or a movement at large, not a single organization, and a grant-making foundation that distributes money to vetted organizations who are really moving the needle on a particular issue. So as you can see on the right, we only fund organizations who are movement-minded, will work with one another, and are sustainable and trustworthy, which helps ensure that our investments are more likely to succeed. And I'll give you a sense for what a SAFE alliance looks like in real life on the next slide. With an example from SAFE in Minnesota, which was launched just last year. The unfortunate reality we know is that sexual exploitation and trafficking is happening in every county of Minnesota and every suburb of the Twin Cities area. So we offer a way to invest in it, as Michelle and Heather both explained, strategically, holistically, and collaboratively across the entire spectrum. So in 9 months, from March to December of 2020, we developed relationships with 17 multidisciplinary leaders. We raised $300,000 and made grants to 5 leaders representing 6 different organizations. And we do it in, as Heather will explain in a minute, a phased strategy where we're focused on addressing urgent needs and critical gaps as identified collaboratively by our leaders in the field who are the experts. And we do this process in phases where we do it, every year, every 2 years. Each SAFE's a little bit different, their timeline. But note that we're not only working with nonprofit leaders, we have representatives from the legislature as well as law enforcement. So in Minnesota, we have the commander of the Human Trafficking Task Force of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension on our council, because strategic holistic solutions really need these voices included. Without them, you're missing entire pieces of the puzzle. So when you invest in a SAFE fund, this is the kind of collaboration you're seeing and supporting. I'll turn it back to Heather.
Thanks, Kari. Sorry, I'm trying to monitor the chat and make sure that, oops. Oh, I clicked on something in your slide, because it was such a cool link. Here we go. Sorry. There we go. So I love that slide that Kari put up, and every SAFE in every location has a slide like that with all their different partners with all the logos. It's awesome to see the alliances come together across communities. And having a diverse set of partners helps us create a really good strategy. And this is how that process happens each time. So if you look at the number 1 in the red box there, the first thing that we do is we gather the experts, anti-trafficking experts. So law enforcement, the leader of the nonprofits, and the justice system, and we listen. These guys are on the front lines every day, and they know what the movement needs better than we do. And so we listen and we brainstorm what are the most critical needs in the movement right now. Not what does your organization need, but what does the movement need at this current time. And then we go to number 2, that brainstorm list goes through a ranking process. We send it out to our partners all across the state, our frontline partners that are doing the work on the ground, and they rank all the things that got brainstormed, and the things that rise to the top of that list make the phased strategy for that particular time. Then we head to number 3. We share an RFP, a request for proposal, and we solicit proposals from organizations doing work from all across the state. The SAFE Advisory Board vets those proposals. So this is where we kind of turn into like a grant making foundation where we're looking at proposals and vetting them and deciding where the SAFE fund should go. We pick the ones that fit the strategy best and that are meeting those most critical needs in the movement right now. And then number 4, we share that strategy with the numbers in it and the dollars with our investors. We raise the money, excuse me, and then we fund the items on the strategy. And then it goes to number 5. We fund the entire strategy. Once we've raised all the money, it's been about $300,000 per strategy. And Every SAFE's in a different level of their strategy, but SAFE in Washington's on phase 5, which we'll talk about in a second. So we fund the whole strategy and then we report back to all our investors and we celebrate together. The donors, the law, nonprofits, the law enforcement, justice system, business people, everybody who's been part of SAFE that year and all that's been accomplished, we get together and we celebrate. And then we just rinse and repeat this model. We just go around and around and around and around. We get the experts together, discern the needs, set a strategy, raise the money, fund the thing, celebrate, and around we go. And the reason we do this one phase at a time is so that we can stay up to date on the most critical needs in the movement. You've heard me say that like 20 times probably. But also what's cool about this cycle is that not only are we staying current with the critical needs and then doing it again and again, we're also bringing joy to our investors. Because we call them investors, not donors at SAFE, because we expect a return on an investment. It won't be monetary, but we do expect to move the needle. And so we report back and tell them how they are. And our investors know that their monies are going straight to the cause because we don't have big nonprofit overhead. They're funding vetted organizations because we've done that work. And they're working on this cause they're passionate about. And they're regularly hearing victories and the impact they're making. And that's what I believe Barry wanted when he called me so breathlessly all those 9 years ago now. And that's the benefit that he and every other investor receives when they support SAFE. Barry, I saw Barry last week. We had our we're setting our phase 5 strategy at SAFE in Washington. We had a celebration of what we accomplished through phase 4 and he was there. He's still investing in SAFE. So it shows that it's still working and people are still engaged all this time later. The other thing to note from this, about this model from the investor perspective, is that they're able to support the whole movement. Investors don't have to figure out which nonprofit's doing the best work, how do they vet them, all that stuff. They can just say, I'm supporting anti-trafficking in Washington State, and they feel great about that. It's a win for them. So before we close, I'll give you a couple examples of how SAFE is moving the needle in Washington State. So you can get a sense of just kind of this model in action. So example number 1, our phase 1 strategy item, we got the experts together. We asked them, what's the most critical need in the movement? And they said, we need more beds. At that point, we had 3 beds in all of King County. King County is the county that Seattle, Washington is in. 2.2 million people live in King County, and we had 3 beds for a girl, for anybody, for any victim to get out of the life at that moment in time. So we needed more beds for victims to be able to call the hotline and get out. And so we did the vetting, funded an organization to put together an emergency receiving center, 24/7 place where girls and women can get out of the life. And I'll tell you, the ERC opened in November 2016, and hundreds of victims have come through that place since then. And it is beauty from ashes every day in that place. And it's been awesome. And SAFE gave them $300,000 to help get it open sooner and then fund part of their first year of operating. And it's been amazing. But the result of that, as you can see there in red, is that a bunch of victims got out of life, praise the Lord, and they've become survivors, which is awesome. But now survivors need other services, right? So as we were moving forward in our phases, that became a critical need in phase 3. Hey, we got a lot of survivors now. We didn't have them before. Now we have a bunch of survivors, and survivors need jobs and housing. So in our phase 3 strategy, we addressed that, and 2 orgs came together. One of them trains the survivors and gets them ready for the job market, gets them a professional attire, that kind of stuff. And then the other one is working to bring employers in. And they have 17 employers who have gotten trained and are ready to hire sex trafficking survivors, which is pretty awesome. The second example there, in our phase 2 strategy, we wanted to fund prevention curriculum, just like you all do, in high schools in King County. So again, that's the county that Seattle is in, biggest county in Washington State. And the result of doing that, we used a curriculum from Chicago originally and then catered it for kids in Seattle, is that thousands of teenagers got educated. And we proved the curriculum worked. It really got proved out. And so then as that was continuing to go, this year when we were doing our phase 5 strategy, the experts are saying, hey, we need that curriculum everywhere else. Can we do that other places? Because that's a critical need now. So we're taking this proven curriculum, catering it to rural areas, et cetera, and spreading it around Washington State. because this year in phase 5 for us, that's a critical need. So we believe these are the kinds of things that can happen when people get behind a movement and the most critical needs at the time versus funding an organization here and an organization there. And that's the success of the SAFE model. SAFE does no direct service. So I want to be clear about that. We are a funding organization, really, strategic funding organization. We have nonprofit partners that are doing all that and are doing great work, but we set a strategy for the movement and we generate money to get after what the movement needs. So like that hourglass that Kari showed you earlier, I'm always doing this with my hands when I'm describing the SAFE model. Like we bring the money in and we get it out to fund the movement, and then we bring it in and we get it out. We bring it in, and it's like a machine. We call it a movement funding machine, and it's working. And as I said, in Washington State, we're currently working on phase 5 strategy. And just last month, this is a significant milestone, I think, for us, is that we granted our $1 million out to the anti-trafficking movement in our state. $1 million has come through SAFE in that hourglass to go out to the anti-trafficking orgs that are doing great work on the front lines. So it's significant. But as you know from hearing Kari, it's not just happening in Washington anymore. So here's the locations across the US. There are 6 right now where those red pins are. SAFE in Washington, there's one in Colorado working around Denver, Kari's in Minnesota, and there are 3 in Florida right now, which is awesome. They're working together, but there's lots of trafficking orgs down there. And then the blue stars on that map show where 3 others are in the works. In Chicago, Illinois, in the Carolinas, I think they're going to do one together, and then in kind of the Phoenix, Arizona area. And each SAFE is funding their local movement, but we're also connected to each other in this kind of nationwide network so we can learn from one another, not reinvent the wheel in our state, that kind of thing. And the last thing I'll say is we've developed a playbook for starting a SAFE. We have an entire launch guide that will guide folks step by step through creating an alliance in their region. And so maybe your state or your region is next. Thanks for listening today. We'd love to answer any questions.
Simon John, has SAFE considered moving into the labor trafficking? And I think you did allude to that, Heather.
Yeah, Simon, we haven't yet, but I don't think that's outside the realm, right? We decided to fight sexual exploitation because that's where we started. And that's like, we just couldn't imagine those 13-year-old girls in a hotel room with men after men, you know, guy after guy coming, like we just, so that's where we started, but it doesn't mean it couldn't do something else, or it couldn't be international. I saw Kevin's note about if we need any international plan. We don't have an international plan, but we have a playbook and you could take it wherever you want to. So
in all that you guys have done so far, which is amazing. It's just so cool to see everybody playing well in the sandbox together. Mm-hmm. That's important. Funding for organizations that work with boys. Have you guys done that? You mentioned girls several times, and
yeah,
I'm just curious if you guys have had the opportunity to pour into an NGO that maybe also works with boys.
I love that question, Susan, because that has been on our hearts for a long time. It seems like when we started this, we always talk about girls, 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 and that tugs at people's hearts. And so then we just keep talking about that, but there's a bunch of boys and men that are victims. And so that's been percolating. And it just, each year when we talk about the most critical needs, it hasn't risen to the top as one of the most critical things until this year for SAFE in Washington. And in our phase 5 strategy, we put in, I think it's $55,000 to do 2 things to help men and boys who are victims. One is we have an organization out here called Seattle Against Slavery, but they do technology that's been used across the country that combs, they do like these bots that comb websites where people are being advertised for sex. And then they have an outreach process to reach out to all those victims to then hopefully get them into services or talking to someone or whatever. And they've been doing that for a long time and combing sites that are selling people for sex. And they always found like, oh, it's 2% men, it's 3% men. What they learned is that boys are getting sold other places. And so we funded them this year to help comb a lot of other sites, the sites where men and boys are being sold. And then we funded another organization to do all the outreach, and they are hiring, they just hired a male survivor.
Nice.
To do that work, to do outreach, to provide resources, that kind of stuff. And we are working with, there's an incredible organization in Chicago called Emmaus that does work specifically with men and boys. And their director's an incredible human. We've become friends. They are helping because they have so much experience with this. They're helping inform our strategy out here. So we're learning from each other and we're leaning in because it matters. So thanks for your question. We hope to learn a lot this year and make a dent there and then continue to push down that road.
Awesome. Awesome.
How about, are you seeing specific organizations working with LGBTQ plus community beds and housing specifically for those individuals?
Yeah, great question, Kevin. All of the organizations we fund are inclusive of those communities. We don't have a specific strategy item, or we haven't yet, to focus on that population, but we ensure that all of our partners are funding that population. Like we would never, because they're often more, and we're finding this more and more in all the research, more exploited than others.
Yes.
You can't leave them out. I listened to a webinar with a transgender woman, and she said, people think just because I'm transgender means that I prostitute myself. And that's not okay. And I was like, that is not okay. So we are making sure that all of our orgs are inclusive when they're doing housing, when they're doing outreach, when they're doing drop-in centers, all of that.
Yeah, it's just expected in Thailand. If you're, if your gender feel different gender-wise, you're sexually trafficked.
Right. Yeah, it's terrible.
The concern I have is that even within the community of people who have been in slavery, they're going to face, labeling and ostracizing. And so how do we encourage maybe separate places for them?
Yeah, I do think in one org out here, there's a survivor support group that is specifically for people that don't identify as male or female. They have a fluid or non-binary, whatever it happens to be. And so there is a safe place for that. But I think you're right. We have to continue to not discriminate.
It looks like you do some powerful work, but in limited areas so far. How do communities or states become part of SAFE? Do you recruit them, or do they come to you? And what I'm thinking about is all along the southern border right now. I mean, we've got a trafficking crisis that we haven't seen in about 8 years. And I mean, what you could be doing, what an organization like yours could be doing, in and around the border right now it just can't be understated.
Yeah, it's a good question, James. It's been some of both, right? Some people come to us, they hear about SAFE. I speak at things all the time and they're like, I want that. Can you make it happen in my town? I don't make it happen everywhere. I make it happen in Washington, but then I have connections to people that are helping make it happen other places. So sometimes it's a pull, and then sometimes it's a push. Like this guy mentioned in Chicago that works with men and boys.
Yeah.
I was like, hey, y'all should start a SAFE out there. You got good providers doing good work. Let's go.
I guess what I'm thinking is that the success you have is so striking. And I mean, I don't know if anybody's ever done it, but there really isn't any reason why NGOs couldn't franchise.
Absolutely. That's absolutely. And that's kind of how this thing works is a franchise. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if you want to send me a note, or if there's orgs like down there or folks that you think could franchise, or wherever you guys are,
Sure.
Happy to get in touch with those folks and then put them in touch with the people that will help with the launch guide and all of that.
Good deal.
Yeah, thanks for your question.